Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Lost in Translation, brought to you by Team Sonar 5's Beamer, who's going to give you the rundown on the differences between the English and the Japanese lore for the latest Shadowverse expansion. This video is proudly brought to you by the new website Shadowverse Master, which is your one-stop shop for all the latest meta trends and the top decks, so make sure to check that out if that is something you're interested in. So the purpose of today's video is to highlight the key differences between the English translation and the Japanese source material, so that you can better understand the areas that were lost in translation. Japanese can be a pretty difficult language to translate, as sometimes the words can be heavily context-driven, and sometimes there's no direct translation to English. For example, certain words in Japanese can have multiple different meanings, and the translators need to make a judgment call on which meanings apply and how to translate that into English in a way that makes sense, and that can be pretty challenging sometimes. So this video will cover some of the more interesting nuances in the Japanese lore and also point out some of the actual translation errors that the official English translation made as well. So to start off with, we'll talk about asphalt. So in Japanese, it's called Hachigoku Makyo asphalt, which Hachigoku basically means like 8 jails, and Makyo is one of those words which can have a lot of different meanings. So for example, demon infested place, an ominous location, and one which I won't get too much into, but it's also got like a Zen concept as well. So look, ultimately it's difficult to get all of that meaning across into like 2 or 3 words in English. So I think Eightfold Abyss is a pretty reasonable localization choice, but it is worth thinking about the background context for it. And as I said, moving forward, there's a lot of Japanese words which can have multiple different meanings. So English translation often just requires creative or contextual judgment to get the right call. So moving on is the condemned trait. So this is one of those localization choices which I think demands a little bit more context around it. So in Japanese, it's just Hachigoku, which is just the 8 jails, referring to asphalt, obviously, right? You can't really tell this literally and have it look good in English, so they decided to call the trait condemned instead. My suggested alternative would just be asphalt, but condemned is cooler, right? But your trade-off is that it implies that the wardens and the enforcers are also condemned, right? And condemned being like an actual word in English, which, in this case, if you were Japanese and you're looking at their version, there is no implication whatsoever that the enforcers or wardens are condemned, whereas obviously the convicts are, right? And this is one of those Reddit posts which I had a look at, and this guy had like a misunderstanding because he was like, oh, why are the convicts and enforcers both condemned? Well, actually, it's just a localization choice. They're not actually condemned, so just something to point out. In terms of the trailer comparison between English and Japanese, overall I think it was a really strong translation. I think the English voice actors did a really good job, but they did make a few changes in relation to Cutthroat's lines towards the end. So I'll go with the small one first. So the first one is, in English he goes, no matter where you lock me up, I'll break out. Versus in Japanese, he goes like, hella purgatory, it doesn't matter to me, I'll cut open my path no matter what, right? So, I mean, it's a pretty minor difference, you're not really losing much there. But I think there was like one major kind of error, which like gives you the wrong impression. So, in the English version, obviously he says, the jailer, he goes, crime demands punishment, right? And then his response is, you know nothing about me, my sins are mine alone to bear, right? Which kind of implies that Kizrael knows exactly what a sin is, and he's not agreeing with his interpretation of what punishment he deserves for his sin. But in the Japanese version, Kizrael is like basically ranting, monologuing, if you will. Crime demands punishment, and he just responds with shitakoto janai dakedo, which basically just means I don't care what you think. So it doesn't really imply that Kizrael knows exactly what the punishment is. It doesn't imply that his judgment is wrong. It's just I don't care, right? Which gives you a different kind of vibe in terms of in terms of the character. So it's only this minor issue. I think the rest of the trailer is pretty good. I won't go through the videos. So just go to the next slide. So this part is covering all of the Swordcraft cards related to Asphalt. So each of the different characters, or the convicts, right, they're split into 6 chapters with each of the cards related to them. And then there's 2 for the Warden, which is an angel that's reincarnated to view the world. And then there's 2 for the Enforcer, which is the jailer, right? So I'll cover each of them one by one. So for the first one, this one is pretty accurate translation. I think there's only two things to note, and this goes for all of them. So the first one is that in Japanese, they don't call it the Hall of Virtue. They just call it the seventh hall, pretty much. And then the other one is it also explicitly refers to them as a special grade convict, not just as a normal convict, right? So apart from that, there's no other noteworthy differences, but just know that these two basically appear on all 6 parts for the Barbaros backstory. Okay, so moving on, he continues to give his daughter lessons. So don't take lives, don't steal from the people. Those are the moral principles of our ship. And then everyone agreed that he was an honest and just pirate. So I think the only difference between the English and Japanese version, and it's pretty minor at best, is here it says "Otosan wa seigi no kaizoku datte," which is basically saying, Dad is a pirate of righteousness or justice, right? Pretty small difference. Moving on to chapter 3, so this is where there is actually a translation error. So anyone who threatens your freedom is an enemy. That is the way of the pirates of Beltesor. Okay, now here it actually says "Jiu o ubao mono no teki," which means like the enemy of those who steal away other people's freedom, and then "Sole ga Beltesor kaizoku danda." So it's basically saying like that is the Beltesor pirate crew. So I guess like if you put them together, it's basically saying the pirate crew of Beltesor are the enemies of those who steal away other people's freedom, right? And this is completely different from anyone who threatens your freedom is an enemy. No, it's actually saying anyone who threatens the freedom of the people is the enemy of the pirates of Beltesor. The thing is, if you read it with the English translation here, it basically implies like, oh, well, if anyone infringes on your personal freedom, then they're the enemies of pirates of Beltesor. But actually, it's more like anyone who threatens the collective people's freedom. For example, evil pirates. For example, corrupt politicians. Right? They're the enemies of the pirates of Beltesor. So big difference. Now, going to chapter 4, I let the man go because he pleaded for his life, but he attacked me when I wasn't looking. I can't continue being this naive. I have to become stronger. I'm the daughter of Captain Beltesor after all. Now, this one is not like a mistranslation per se, but it's losing a lot of context, right? Because in Japanese, we use pronouns, and depending on which pronoun you use, it can have different meanings and inferences. So here I've bolded this part here, which I think is really important. So it goes, motto tsuyoku naranai to, which basically means like I need to become stronger. Watashi wa, like, which is a feminine like pronoun, and then she corrects herself and she goes, yeah, like no, boku wa, which boku is being like more of a boyish like masculine kind of pronoun. And after that he says, Captain Beltesor no musume dakara, so because I'm the daughter of Captain Beltesor. So like the quick recap on JP pronouns is that boku is you're referring to yourself, and usually used by boys and young males, whereas watashi is like, although it is like gender neutral, considering her age as well, it would be considered feminine, right? So this is like a huge turning point where basically she thinks she needs to get stronger, and so like the change between like the more feminine pronoun to the masculine pronoun like is part of like her mentality shift. So you completely miss this in English. Now again, don't blame the translators for doing this, because it's not a straight translation. Usually the way you would do it is you would potentially change like the way they refer to themselves, like in terms of their attitude, their confidence level, like some of the words they say, but there's no straight translation, and it's very time consuming. So it is what it is. You just have to accept that English and Japanese will usually have differences here. Okay, so chapter 5, Dad's too soft. Why can't we kill evil people or steal for a just reason? It's so inefficient, obsolete, just like the ship. I can't do anything I want. There is no freedom to be had here, right? So this one actually has a pretty major translation error. So what it actually says here is this line here. So Zenkara ubawazu, which basically means like don't steal from good people, right? And this line here is akudemo kolosazu, which basically means like even if they're evil, don't kill them, right? So this line is basically translated correctly, but this one is inefficient, right? Because this one's incorrect, because actually it's saying don't steal from good people, but they've made it into a just reason. So the actual correct translation is why can't we kill evil people? Why can't we steal from good people? Which completely changes her moral code and her character. And then this part here, so this is a more literal translation, so it's not a translation error or anything, but basically my interpretation is, she's saying it's so inefficient, it makes me want to puke. It's so old and outdated, just like this ship. I just don't feel at home here anymore. Sigh. Somehow it just feels kind of lacking in freedom here. So I think the main difference between like this translation, which is basically the Japanese version, and the official English one, is that I think it really shows like the frustration and the suffocation that Barbaros has. When she's on that ship and she's forced to follow like her dad's principles, right, which she doesn't actually agree with. So I think if you got the same kind of feeling from the English translation, okay, fine, that's good. But if you didn't get that feeling, then I think the official English translation has essentially kind of lost that important nuance. Chapter 6, so if we kill our enemies, they won't come back for revenge. If we steal from the people, we can offset our losses. The chests or the results speak for themselves. The real thief was my father for trying to take away my freedom. So this one, it's edgier in Japanese, actually. So in Japanese, she says something along the lines of here. So, 教えという呪いで僕を縛り自由を奪ってたんだから. So this basically means like Oshia in this context is talking about like his learnings, so like being justice and all that, right? And it's also calling it's calling it a curse that binds her, right? And steals her freedom. So this really shows like her thought process here, right? That she actually thinks it's a literal curse, right? As opposed to it just being, oh, it's more efficient to do it this way, but actually it's like, this is literally infringing on like, my moral code. It's infringing on my freedom, which I value above all else, right? And also, as I note here, she uses the word boku here from here onwards instead of watashi. And if you listen to the card in Japanese, she refers to herself with boku, right? So that's like, again, context which you're not going to notice unless you've seen the Japanese law. So Barbaros herself, there's a couple of changes here. So look, at the end of the day, it's like if there's a treasure you want, do whatever it takes, no matter how unscrupulous or vicious you have to be. And akuratsu here, it has a multiple number of different meanings. So like, the way I see it, like the way my brain interprets this is I look at it like with 4 definitions at once, which is usually not something you do in English, but yeah, it's just one of those things in Japanese. And then also, I think one of the other things is here it goes, join me, we'll raise our sinful sails and start for a new golden age for pirates. Cue One Piece theme song, I guess. But here in Japanese, she's more like kind of inviting them to fall together with her. And teaching them about her principles and leading them towards depravity together, right? And togetherness is like a real theme, I feel. If you listen to the voice lines of the cards related to her, all of them are really loyal to her. I think one of the characters even says something along the lines of like, you're the only one who's nice to me. So it implies that basically she really cares about her, crewmates. She really cares about freedom, and she wants to do it like together with them, right? So that's a neat point because like, from a certain context, you might feel that she's like completely fucked, but in reality, she actually does care about the people. And here it's once again she refers to like kind of the code of ethics that her father had as amai juso, which basically means like a sweet, alluring curse. And then she also says something along the lines of like, stick with me and we'll make the seas ours. But it's actually, in the English version, right? But in the Japanese version, it's more like, don't be scared, it'll be okay. We'll enjoy the fall together. So again, it's basically inviting them to join her. Like, it's got a different feel to it, I feel. And over here, she doesn't say we'll make the seas ours, but she actually says she'll rule over all the seas in the universe. Look, I don't think that like that's probably just a Japanese edgy thing to say. Not really a big deal. And she also refers to ambition as the ultimate vice, which she doesn't really mention here. And then they don't translate the last line, which is like, let's sing together, you good for nothings. But I don't think it really changes too much, to be perfectly honest. Now this one is where we will eventually see like major differences between the changes between the English and the Japanese version. So Warden Part 1. Eager to fathom the world below, I became a pirate's apprentice. The captain was a just and noble man, though his daughter was not. On the day she mutinied against her father, I learned man's true capacity for evil. Now, in the JP version, it explicitly mentions that he learned of man's innate goodness, but that he also learned of man's evil when the daughter betrayed the father. So essentially, what this is saying is that in the English version, it doesn't actually, acknowledge that he knew about justice, right? Like all it says is that father was like a person who, was a just and noble man, but actually it's the warden himself who realizes like, the world is good, like what justice and all that is. So that's something that you should probably note in terms of like the difference in translation. And also in the Japanese version, it's more like warden of loyalty, not warden of honor. Now I know obviously they're like tangentially like similar in meaning, but it's quite different, and it'll be explained why in part 2 of this law. So in part 2 of the law, the English translation, extolling the merits of sin, she attacked the captain and those loyal to him. My final memory from within that burning ship was glimpsing the teary-eyed father renounce his wayward daughter as she cursed his name. Now, there's a major translation error here. So this line here, katame kara namida o koboshitsuzu, juzo haku musume no sugata datta, which basically means well, it's explicit that it's actually the daughter that was teary-eyed, not the father, right? So that changes the way that you view the situation, because in the English translation, it makes her seem a lot more ruthless when she's cutting down her father. But actually, this is more like, it shows hesitation that she has. It shows like the remaining kind of love that she has for her father, even though she's cursing him, right? But like, that deep down, that attachment, that feeling of like, betrayal that she feels towards him, the fact that he was the one that taught her about freedom, like all of that type of like emotional, like, baggage, right? It's a lot more clear if it's the daughter that's teary-eyed, but you lose all of that if it's translated incorrectly here as a teary-eyed father. Now, second note is in the Japanese version, it's also explicitly stated that the warden is a part of the faction loyal to the father that was attacked. Now, in English, it's a lot more ambiguous, right? Because he's just a spectator in the English version, right? It doesn't say he's part of the loyal faction, and especially because his name is Warden of Honor, not Warden of Loyalty. So if his name is Warden of Loyalty, you'd be like, oh, who is he loyal to, right? And then you make the implication that it's referring to loyal to his father, right? Loyal to Barbaros' father. But in the English translation, that detail is completely lost. So Enforcer Part 1, so freedom is a privilege not afforded to the likes of you, is conferred to those who shun vice and leave lives of virtue, scourge of the seas. You have failed to curb your sinful ways. I, the seventh Enforcer, will strip you of all freedom. I think this is a pretty good translation. It's not completely literal, but it gets the important points across. The only thing I would think is I feel as though in the Japanese version, the Enforcer feels a bit more disgusted and condescending in his tone, but I think it's fine. Enforcer Part 2, so English again, mine is the blade of virtue, and with its strike shall justice be meted. With a flash you shall be humbled, and will bow to its sublime justice. Freedom is not your right, you merely borrow it while you are virtuous. May the sentence teach you restraint. So, okay, a few things here, right? I don't think, in Japanese, they don't actually call it the blade of virtue. Actually, it's more like the divine sword, which is like this kanji here, right? And also, it probably means more along the lines of like loyalty, sincerity, allegiance, fidelity, and integrity, not justice. Like, it never mentions the word justice anywhere in Japanese. In fact, I don't even think you can infer that. So I think that's like a translation kind of inconsistency. And then the other part is here he's basically saying like, I'll cut you down I'll cut you in half in a single instant with this blade of integrity. Now, anyway, small difference, like it doesn't really matter. And then finally, I did an alternative kind of translation for this line here. So it's more like, you fool, hurry up and obey the emperor known as virtue. Freedom is a special privilege granted only to the virtuous. Now it is time to accept your punishment from the divine general, the death penalty for lawless criminals such as you, right? And then divine general again, this is just one of multiple interpretations, because this is actually a word that's made up of two different kanji. And you just have to like, put them together and make an interpretation of it. Also, I think like the emperor here that they're referring to, the emperor known as virtue, it's like an abstract referral. So my interpretation is that he's referring to how we should be guided by the emperor that is known as virtue. So like the feeling of virtue, like the moral code that is virtue, right? And it's how you should lead your life, which is in direct contrast to Barbara, who refers to virtue and morality as a sweet, alluring curse. So I feel like in the Japanese version, you're getting like a much a much more nuanced take on it, right? It's like they are fundamentally philosophically opposed in the Japanese version. So key differences, like recapping, is that in the official EN translation, makes Barbaros seem a little less sinful than she is. I feel. In reality, I think she's just an anarchist. She only has one remaining moral code: is that she doesn't kill innocent people. But everything else apparently goes, including stealing from the innocent, which is something that's completely kind of omitted in the English version. And also, I mean, just my interpretation is just obviously kind to a crew as well, right? Which is clear in both English and Japanese. Now, the other one was in the Japanese version, she switches pronouns, which is a huge character development, which is completely missing in the English version. But again, as I said, it's pretty tricky to translate it in the organic way, so no shade on the official translator for not going the extra mile here. And then Warden Chapter 2, there's a major translation error where it states that it's the father who is teary-eyed, but actually it's Barbaros that is teary-eyed, right? And that completely changes the characterization of the character, because if it's only the father that's teary-eyed, it implies that she's kind of heartless when she's killing her own father. But when she's the one who's teary-eyed, it shows that she still has some kind of conscience or love remaining, right? Even though she still does what she thinks needs to be done. TLDR of the law, from my interpretation, is she's a type of psycho that's on social media that posts racial slurs, gets banned, and then she complains about how it's a social media company that's infringing on her freedom of speech. But overall, obviously she is kind of evil, but at least she doesn't kill innocent people, so I guess she's got that going for her, and she values freedom across all else. Above all else. And finally, she's kind to her friends. So how you want to interpret that is up to you. And that basically does it for episode 1 of Lost in Translation. Hope you learned something. If I made any mistakes, feel free to point them out, because obviously I'm also a student of the language. And I'll see you next time.